Rancher lived alone for years, until the Bigfoot returned his wedding ring. He'd lived alone for years out there on the edge of the prairie, just him, a worn cabin, and the ghost of his wife in an old photograph. That winter night, the wind howled through the pines, and he heard footsteps too heavy to belong to any man. He stepped outside, heart-pounding, gun shaking in his hand. Then silence. In the moonlight lay something small, glimmering in the snow. His wedding ring. And beyond the trees a shadow moved, tall, slow, and almost gentle. He whispered, voice trembling, "Thank you, whoever you are." The wind quieted. The fear was gone. Only the ring and the feeling that love had somehow found its way back home. Before we begin, take a moment to comment your city. Where are you watching from tonight? And when the story ends, don't forget to rate it from 0 to 10. Now settle into a quiet place, let the wind of the West carry you into tonight's tale. The year was 1887. High in the frozen mountains of Wyoming, a man named Samuel Burke lived alone. His cabin sat miles from the nearest town, surrounded by nothing but wind wolves and silence. 10 years earlier, his wife Mary had vanished into those same woods after a bitter argument that still burned in his chest like a dying coal. They said the storm took her, but Samuel never believed that. Each night, he sat by the fire with a bottle of whiskey and her old photograph, whispering the same prayer, the same regret. If I'd just stopped her. If I'd just said I was sorry. He hadn't heard another human voice in nearly a decade, only the moan of the wind, the creak of the wood, and the echo of his own guilt bouncing inside the cabin walls. He blamed the forest for taking her, but deep down he blamed himself. The land had become his punishment, and the fire his only company. Outside, the night stretched cold and endless. The snow whispered against the windows, the kind of sound that made a man feel smaller than he ever knew he could be. Samuel poured another drink, stared into the flames, and tried not to remember the warmth of her voice. But memory is a cruel visitor. It always finds its way back home. The cabin popped, the fire hissed, and for a heartbeat he thought he heard her footsteps on the porch. He froze, every muscle tightening, his breath caught halfway to his throat. Only the wind answered, moaning through the cracks of the old wood. He let out a trembling laugh, half sorrow, half madness. Still, something in the air had changed. The silence outside wasn't empty anymore. It was waiting heavy, alive. Samuel rose from his chair, set down the glass, and reached for the rifle that leaned against the wall. The firelight flickered across his face, carving deep lines of loss and fear. Somewhere out in the dark snow, crunched beneath a weight too heavy to belong to any man. He turned toward the sound, heart-pounding, finger on the trigger, eyes fixed on the door. He thought he buried love that night, until something inhuman came to return it. Part 1. The Roar in the Woods. It was near midnight when the storm came down from the mountains, a white curtain that swallowed the world whole. Snow swept across the valley like a tide, hissing against the windows and burying every sound except the heartbeat of the wind. Inside the cabin, Samuel Burke sat motionless by the fire, staring into the flames as though they could burn away the memories that refused to die. The whiskey bottle beside him was half empty. He hadn't moved in an hour. Then came the first sound, low, distant, deep enough that it vibrated through the floorboards. At first he thought it was thunder rolling through the peaks, but the storm had already passed, leaving the air still and bitter cold. The sound came again, longer this time, like a growl echoing through a hollow chest. Samuel lifted his head. The hair on his arms rose. Outside, his 2 dogs began barking, wild and terrified. From the stable came the restless pounding of hooves. He set the bottle aside, grabbed the lantern, and stood. The light cast long shadows over the log walls as he reached for the rifle by the door. Easy now, he muttered to the dogs through the crack of the door. They were snarling at the dark tails, stiff, their breath fogging in the air. Something out there had them spooked. The wind had gone dead, but the night hummed with a strange weight, like the world itself was holding its breath. Samuel stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking under his boots. The snow reflected the faint orange of the lantern, throwing trembling light across the yard. Beyond the fence, the forest rose black and silent. Then he sawed a trail of prints cutting through the snow heading from the tree line, straight toward his barn. Each print was nearly twice the size of his own boot, pressed deep into the frozen crust. His breath clouded in front of him as he crouched down to study them. They weren't bear tracks, not wolf either. The stride was too long, the shape too human. A chill rippled through his chest. He followed the line of prints toward the barn lantern held high, rifle tucked close. The horses were restless inside, stomping and blowing clouds of steam through their nostrils. He whispered to calm them, but his own voice sounded foreign, too thin for the size of the silence around him. Something flickered in the snow near the fence. He stopped. There, half buried under a thin layer of frost, something caught the light, something small and golden. For a second he thought it was just a bottle cap or a brass casing left from a hunt. But when he brushed away the snow, his breath froze in his throat. A ring. It was tarnished and bent, but he knew it instantly. The curve of it. The engraving inside still faintly visible under the grime, Mary and Sam, 1875. His heart stumbled. The ring he'd lost the night she vanished. He'd searched for weeks after the storm, combing the woods until the frostbite had eaten into his fingers. He'd told himself some animal had swallowed it or the river had claimed it forever. But here it was, gleaming weakly in the lantern light like it had been waiting for him all along. He knelt, snow soaking through his knees, and picked it up with shaking hands. His fingers trembled so badly the ring almost slipped away again. For a long moment he just stared at it, mind spinning. The cold air burned his lungs. How in God's name had it come back? A sound broke the stillness, a deep, rasping growl that rolled through the trees. It wasn't far. Samuel turned toward the forest, the lantern swinging wildly in his hand, throwing rings of light into the dark. The growl came again, closer this time, layered with something wet and heavy like air pushed through a throat too large to belong to a man. The dogs bolted for the cabin, whining tails tucked. Samuel raised the rifle and took a step back. "Who's there?" His voice cracked, swallowed by the wind. "Show yourself." Nothing. Only the slow hiss of falling snow. He could feel his pulse hammering behind his eyes. Another growl, louder, sharper, from the left. He spun, rifle leveled. The lantern light brushed the edge of a pine trunk, then another, but nothing moved. He took a breath that cut like glass and shouted, "You took her from me. You hear me? You took her." His words flew into the trees and came back twisted, echoing in a tone that wasn't quite his own. The forest gave him no answer, only the whisper of snow slipping from branches. But the air, it changed. The night grew hotter, tighter, as if the dark itself was closing in around him. A sudden thump shook the ground behind him. He whirled, heart crashing in his chest, but saw only his own cabin in the distance, the windows flickering gold. He took a few steps backward, half expecting something to emerge from the barn or from the shadow under the eaves. His boots sank deep into the snow. Every nerve screamed at him to run, yet he couldn't move. The silence broke with a sharp crack of wood. A fence post snapped, splintering like kindling. Samuel raised the rifle finger, trembling on the trigger. The lantern light flickered against the snow, and for the first time he caught a glimpse of movement between the trees. Something tall, too tall, slipping behind a trunk. He squinted, straining to see through the falling snow. The figure was massive, shoulders broad as a door, covered in hair that glistened under the frost. He blinked, and it was gone. Only the echo of its movement lingered, a faint rustle in the branches high above him. Samuel swallowed hard. The old stories he'd laughed at in the saloon came crawling back from memory tales from the Shoshone hunters about the forest guardian, a creature neither man nor beast roaming the mountains to judge the hearts of men. He used to mock those stories. Now, with the ring cold in his palm, he wasn't so sure. He backed slowly toward the porch, keeping the rifle raised. The dogs barked from inside, frantic. His breath came fast, sharp clouds in the cold air. When he reached the steps, the lantern flame fluttered and died. Darkness dropped like a curtain. For a heartbeat he could see nothing. Then, just at the edge of the trees, two faint red glows, flickered eyes burning like coals watching him from the dark. They didn't blink. They didn't move. They simply stared, unblinking, patient, ancient. Samuel's finger tightened on the trigger. He wanted to shoot to drive the fear out with the sound of gunfire, but his body wouldn't obey. Instead, he felt the weight of the ring in his other hand, small and heavy as the past itself. The eyes blinked once, slow and deliberate. Then they vanished, swallowed by the snow and the black of the woods. Samuel stood there for a long time, the rifle shaking his breath ragged. The dogs whimpered behind the door. Finally, he stumbled back into the cabin and slammed the bolt home. The lantern, still warm, sputtered back to life under his trembling hands. He sank to the floor beside the fire, the ring clenched in his fist. Outside, the wind picked up again, whispering against the windows, but the sound no longer felt like wind. It was deeper, slower, like something breathing just beyond the walls. He stared into the flames until his eyes watered, until the heat blurred the world into a haze of orange and gold. When he finally opened his hand, the ring lay there in his palm, cold as ice. He whispered her name once softly, as though afraid the thing outside might hear. Then from far away, somewhere deep in the forest, the growl came again, long, sorrowful, almost human. Samuel's blood ran cold. He closed his fist around the ring and whispered, "Mary!" The fire cracked, a gust rattled the shutters, and the night swallowed the sound whole. Outside, beneath the endless snow, two faint red eyes blinked once more, watching from the tree line, glowing like embers in the dark. Part 2. The Thing That Knows Her Name. Morning came slow-dragging pale light through the frost-bitten windows. The fire had long died, leaving only cold ashes and a smell of smoke that clung to Samuel's clothes. His head throbbed from the whiskey, and his chest ached from the fear that still gripped him. For a moment he thought the night before had been a dream, a cruel, drunken vision stitched together by loneliness and guilt. He pushed himself up from the floor joints, stiff from the cold. The cabin was quiet again, too quiet. He went to the window. Outside, the world lay buried under a new blanket of snow, clean and untouched, except for a single trail of prints that led up to his porch and stopped at the door. The dogs were gone. Their chains hung loose by the fence, empty, swinging gently in the wind. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath. He reached for his coat and stepped outside. The cold bit into him, instantly sharp as teeth. The morning air was heavy with fog, the kind that moved slow, curling around the trees like breath. He froze. There on the porch, something was waiting for him. A folded piece of red fabric, stiff with frost, neatly placed on the wooden step, like a gift. He bent down, hesitating before his fingers brushed it. It was a scarf, old, torn along the edge, frayed from years of wear. He knew that scarf. His breath hitched. 10 years hadn't been enough to erase the feel of it. He had bought it for Mary their first winter together. She'd worn it every day until the night she disappeared. Samuel lifted it with trembling hands. The fabric was brittle, stiff with ice, but the smell, the faint scent of lavender oil, still clung to it. His knees weakened, and he nearly dropped it. For a moment he couldn't breathe. Then he saw the prints, huge, unmistakable, surrounding the porch. Not the clean, defined steps of boots, but wide impressions with long toes pressed deep into the snow. There was one especially close to the steps, the size of a dinner plate. Inside that print, perfectly centered, lay the faint mark of a smaller handprint, hers pressed in memory or imagination, or something else entirely. Samuel's vision blurred. He stumbled back inside and slammed the door shut, his chest heaving. He threw the bolt and dropped into the chair by the hearth, clutching the scarf to his chest as if it could warm him. "Mary," he whispered. "Mary, what are you doing to me?" He sat like that for a long time, the scarf tangled in his rough hands, until exhaustion pulled him under. That night he dreamed. He was standing in the same forest where she'd vanished. Snow drifted through the air, but the wind was silent. In the dream he could smell the pines and the smoke of distant firewood. And then he saw her, Mary, standing by the tree line, wrapped in the same red scarf, her face, pale eyes full of sorrow. "Mary," he called. She didn't move. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, cracked by the cold. "Sam, please stop running." He took a step toward her. The snow swallowed his boots. running from what her gaze shifted past him toward the shadows behind the trees. From yourself. A sound stirred in the darkness, heavy and slow. He turned to look, but there was nothing there, only the echo of his own breath. When he looked back, she was gone. The cold hit him like a fist. He woke, gasping. The fire had gone out again, and the air inside the cabin was thick and gray. He tried to calm his breathing, telling himself it was only a dream, nothing more. But then he heard it. The door. It was open. Snow had blown in, scattering across the floor. His heart hammered as he reached for the rifle leaning by the wall. He moved toward the door, careful, silent. There were no tracks leading away this time, only inward a trail of melting snow that ended by the far wall. And on that wall, drawn in broad, rough strokes of black, were words written in charcoal. She forgave you. The letters were huge, uneven, burned into the wood like a wound. Samuel dropped the rifle. His throat tightened, and for a long moment no sound came out. Then the sob tore through him, raw and broken. He fell to his knees, his hands clawing at the frozen floor. "Forgave me," he whispered. "No, no, she can't." He pressed his forehead to the floorboards, the cold biting his skin. Tears burned his eyes. "I don't deserve that," he muttered. "Not after what I said. Not after what I did." Memories came like shards. Mary's face streaked with tears, her voice shouting over the wind the night she left. The slamming door, the storm rising, his pride, his silence, the long hours waiting for her to come back, and the day the search party returned empty-handed. Samuel gripped the scarf and the ring so tightly they cut into his palm. Why now, he shouted, voice cracking. Why, after all this time outside, something shifted. The snow creaked, the boards groaned under a heavy weight. He spun, eyes wide. The words on the wall seemed to shimmer in the lamplight. For an instant he thought he saw her standing there again, her shadow stretching long across the floor, but when he blinked, there was nothing. The fear crawled back into him, cold and slow. He snatched the rifle from the ground and stormed out the door boots, crunching through the snow. The sky was iron gray, the forest breathing mist. "If you know her name," he shouted, his voice echoing through the valley, "then show yourself." The echo came back, faint and strange, as if the trees themselves were answering. He turned in a circle, scanning the woods, the frozen stream, the silent barn. Nothing moved. Then came the sound, a low moan, half wind, half voice. It rolled through the trees and brushed against him like a whisper. "Sam." He froze. It wasn't Mary's voice, not exactly. It was deeper, older, but it carried her sadness, the same sorrow that used to hide behind her laughter. He took a step forward, his boots sinking in the snow. "Where are you?" he called. The wind rose. A shadow slipped between the trees. Samuel followed, stumbling through drifts, the rifle clutched to his chest. The forest swallowed him whole, the pines closing in like walls. He didn't know how long he walked, minutes, hours, maybe longer. The cold gnawed at his bones. Then the sound came again, closer. Now a rasping breath, followed by a thud like a giant heartbeat pulsing through the ground. Samuel lifted the lantern, and the light caught something in the fog ahead. A shape. Massive. It moved with impossible grace for its size, every step deliberate, heavy, echoing through the stillness. The mist clung to it like a shroud, revealing only pieces, the curve of a shoulder, the flash of coarse fur, the slow rise and fall of breath. Samuel's throat went dry. He raised the rifle, but his hands shook so badly the barrel wavered. "Come on, then," he shouted. "If you know her name, show me your face." For a moment nothing happened. Then the fog stirred, parting like curtains in a slow, soundless wind. A hand, massive, dark, covered in hair, emerged from the mist and pressed gently into the snow before him. The fingers spread, each one thick as a branch, ending in nails dulled by age. Steam rose from the creature's skin. The hand trembled not in anger but in something else, something almost human. Samuel's breath hitched. He took one slow step back. The rifle felt useless now, absurd in his hands. He looked up. From the mist came a pair of eyes, not the red coals he'd seen the night before, but soft amber, deep and wet, filled with something he hadn't seen in years' sorrow. For a heartbeat, the world was silent, only snow falling between them, slow and weightless. Samuel lowered the gun. His voice came out barely above a whisper. "What are you?" The creature said nothing. It only looked at him, and in that gaze was recognition and understanding that cut through fear. It knew him. It knew her. Samuel's knees weakened. The ring slipped from his fingers and disappeared into the snow. He fell to his hands, gasping, tears freezing on his beard. The creature tilted its head, a low rumble deep in its chest, not a growl this time, but something mournful like grief given voice. Samuel lifted his head just as the wind rose again. Snow swirled between them, a veil of white. And then, as quietly as it had appeared, the shape faded back into the trees, the mist closing around it like water. Only the handprint remained pressed deep into the snow before him, steaming faintly in the cold. Samuel stared at it for a long time, heart pounding, unable to move. He didn't know if what he'd seen was real or madness or something between. But when he finally looked down there beside the great handprint was another small and delicate, pressed faintly into the ice, a woman's hand frozen in time. He reached out to touch it, but it melted at his fingertips. Behind him, somewhere in the distance, came a long, low cry that echoed through the mountains, a sound that carried sorrow, memory, and something like forgiveness. Samuel whispered into the cold Mary. The forest answered with silence. But for the first time in 10 years, that silence didn't feel empty. It felt alive. Part 3. The Monster and the Man. The snow came again that night, soft at first, then heavier until it muffled the world in white silence. The storm swallowed every sound but one, the hollow echo of Samuel Burke's heart pounding in his chest. He stood alone in the yard, rifle raised, his breath hanging in the air like smoke. The creature was still there, half hidden by the mist at the edge of the trees. It hadn't moved since the moment it showed its hand. Now slowly it straightened, taller than any man Samuel had ever seen. The faint amber light from the lantern caught in its eyes, glimmering with something that wasn't anger, but something older, like sorrow, made flesh. Samuel's grip tightened on the rifle. His arms trembled. He could feel the cold of the metal seeping through his gloves, the sharp sting of fear running through his veins. Every instinct told him to fire, to end whatever this was before it came closer. But the creature didn't advance. It stood there in the falling snow, breath misting in slow, heavy clouds. Then, with deliberate calm, it began to open its enormous hand. Something small gleamed in its palm, a thin silver chain, tangled but unmistakable. Samuel's throat closed. Mary's necklace. He'd given it to her the day they married. A simple locket with a pressed wildflower inside, faded now, but still visible behind the cracked glass. She had been wearing it the night she vanished. He hadn't seen it since. The rifle sagged in his hands. Where did you get that?" he whispered, voice trembling. The creature made no sound, no movement except to hold the necklace higher, letting it swing gently in the lantern light. Samuel staggered back a step. His chest felt too tight to breathe. In a flood, the memories came, the last fight, the slamming door, the look on Mary's face when she turned away. He had shouted things he couldn't take back. Pride had choked his apology, and when the storm came, he had let her walk out into it. He saw again the way she had turned at the tree line, the wind whipping her scarf, her voice quiet but steady. "If you ever lose me, remember love is not the cage, it's the key." The words had haunted him ever since. He had built his own cage out of guilt and fear and lived in it for 10 long years. Now, standing face to face with something impossible, those words came roaring back like thunder in his ears. The creature took a slow step forward. Samuel's panic snapped. He lifted the rifle, cocked it, and shouted, "Stay back!" The creature stopped. For a long heartbeat they faced each other, man and myth, both trembling from something deeper than fear. Then Samuel fired. The gunshot cracked through the night like lightning. The echo bounced off the mountains, and the smell of gunpowder filled the air. The creature staggered, not from a bullet wound, but from the sound itself. It threw back its head and let out a roar so deep the ground seemed to shake beneath Samuel's boots. Birds scattered from the trees. The lantern shattered at his feet. Samuel fell backward into the snow, eyes wide. The creature didn't attack. It turned instead, vanishing into the forest with a sound like thunder fading in the distance. Samuel scrambled to his feet. "Wait!" he shouted, his voice raw. "Come back." But the wind swallowed his words. He grabbed the rifle, slung it over his shoulder, and ran after the giant shadow, disappearing through the storm. The forest closed around him, dark and endless. Branches clawed at his coat, tore at his face. His boots slipped on the frozen ground, but he didn't stop. He followed the massive footprints deeper into the valley where the mist thickened. "Mary!" he yelled into the trees. "Mary, where are you?" His voice cracked. The snow swallowed the sound. He stumbled forward, gasping, until the earth dropped away beneath him. He reached out too late and fell. The world turned white. When he opened his eyes again, everything hurt. His leg throbbed in agony. The rifle was gone, the lantern too. Above him, the cliff face loomed 20 feet high, jagged and slick with ice. He tried to stand, but the pain in his ankle drove him back down. He was trapped. The cold began to seep in. He felt it creeping up from the ground, numbing his hands, his face. The snow fell silently, covering him like a shroud. "God help me," he whispered. But even as he said it, he knew God had stopped listening a long time ago. The pain blurred his vision. The cold made his thoughts drift. For a while he didn't know if he was awake or dreaming. Somewhere above, something moved, heavy, deliberate. Snow cascaded down from the edge of the cliff. Then a shadow blotted out the faint moonlight. The creature. It stood at the rim, looking down at him. Its breath came in slow plumes. Samuel braced for the end, for claws or teeth or darkness. Instead, he felt a tremor under him, a vibration deep and steady, the sound of movement closer now. He blinked through the haze. The creature was climbing down, using its massive arms to lower itself with surprising care. Its fur brushed the snow from the rock as it descended. Samuel tried to speak, but his voice was gone. His body shook uncontrollably. He closed his eyes, expecting the weight of death. Instead, something warm wrapped around him. A massive hand, rough and strong, slid beneath his shoulders and lifted him as if he weighed nothing. He gasped from the pain, but the creature moved gently, carefully, as it carried him up the slope. The air filled with the scent of earth and pine sap. The creature's chest rumbled softly, almost like humming. When Samuel opened his eyes again, they were back near the cabin. The door stood open, light flickering inside. The creature lowered him to the ground beside it. Then it stepped back into the snow, watching him. Samuel's vision blurred. He wanted to speak, to thank it, or beg, or curse, but the words tangled in his throat. He could only stare as the figure turned away, disappearing once more into the forest. Darkness took him. When he woke, he was in his bed. The fire was burning again, the room warm. His leg was wrapped in torn strips of linen, bandaged tight and clean. Someone had stitched the wound on his calf. The rifle leaned against the wall, oiled and ready. He turned his head and saw the silver chain hanging from a nail above the mantel. Mary's necklace. Tears welled in his eyes. His breath came shallow and uneven. He didn't know how long he lay there, staring at that simple locket glinting in the firelight. When he finally found the strength to sit up, something caught his eye near the door. The floor was wet. The snow melted in wide, uneven patches. Footprints, massive ones, led from the door to his bedside and back out again. He swung his legs over the edge, ignoring the pain, and limped to the door. It was unlatched. The cold night air slipped in, biting his face. He opened it wider and looked out. The snow was smooth again, except for a trail that led away toward the trees. At the edge of that trail, in the clean white powder, words had been drawn in long, crooked lines of red. Not written in ink. Not paint. Blood. He stared at the message until the world began to tilt. Don't run from love. The letters were uneven, clumsy, but they were there, carved into the earth with purpose. Samuel sank to his knees, the cold biting through his clothes. His hands pressed into the snow, shaking. He whispered, barely audible, "Don't run." A sob caught in his chest. He had spent 10 years running from Mary's memory, from the guilt that burned him alive. Every bottle, every silence, every lonely night by the fire had been his escape from what he'd done. And now something from the woods. Something no man could explain had come to drag him back toward forgiveness. He looked down at his hands. The blood had smeared onto his fingers. He didn't know if it was his or the creature's. He didn't care. He lifted his eyes to the sky. The clouds had broken, revealing a stretch of stars so sharp and cold they looked carved from glass. For the first time in years, he didn't feel small beneath them. He felt seen. His voice was a whisper. Maybe it wasn't a monster after all. The wind answered, carrying the faintest echo through the trees, low, steady, and filled with something almost tender. Samuel listened until the sound faded into the night, and for the first time since Mary's disappearance, he didn't feel afraid. He felt forgiven. Part 4. The Fire and the Truth. The thaw came late that year, and the valley seemed slower to wake. Snow melted into mud, rivers swelled, and for the first time in months, the sky above the mountains showed streaks of blue instead of gray. But peace never lasts long in the West. Not when men smell a story worth telling. By spring, word had spread. It started in the saloon down at Red Hollow. A trapper came back from the northern ridge, shaking pale as bone, talking about a giant in the woods. Said he'd found footprints the size of frying pans and a shack torn apart like kindling. Within a week, hunters, drifters, and drunkards were whispering the same tale. They called it the Devil of the Divide, a beast that walked like a man and screamed like the wind. Samuel heard them from the back of the bar, his hands clenched tight around his glass. They didn't know what they were talking about. They didn't know him. He tried to keep quiet. But when they started talking about bringing guns and torches, something inside Samuel snapped. He stood, slammed his fist on the counter, and said through gritted teeth, "You hunt that creature and you'll burn this land to hell." The laughter that followed was cruel. "Old man," one of them sneered, "you've been alone too long. Maybe the devil's got your mind already." He walked out before his temper killed him. The moment he stepped into the cold, he knew what he had to do. He saddled his horse and rode home through the dark, the sky heavy with the smell of rain. By the time he reached the cabin, thunder rolled through the hills. He looked toward the forest, and a feeling part fear, part duty settled deep in his bones. He knew the hunters would come, and he knew the creature wouldn't fight them. The next morning, they arrived 6 men on horseback, armed to the teeth, rifles slung over their shoulders, torches bound with pitch sacks of dynamite hanging from their saddles. The leader, a scarred man named Dalton Reeves, spat in the dirt when he saw Samuel. "You the one been feeding it?" Samuel stood firm on his porch coat, whipping in the wind. "You don't understand," he said. "It ain't what you think." Reeves grinned, yellow teeth showing. "Then tell me what it is, Burke. 'Cause I've seen what it's done to the trees. Looks like a devil to me." Samuel shook his head. "He's not the devil. He's mercy." Laughter erupted again, harsh as gunfire. Reeves waved a hand. "Mercy don't leave tracks big as wagon wheels. You stay out of our way, old man." They rode past him, torches blazing into the woods. Samuel watched them go, heart pounding. For a long time he stood there, torn between reason and instinct. Then he grabbed his coat, his rifle, and a bucket of water, and followed them into the fire he knew was coming. By nightfall, the forest glowed orange on the horizon. The smell hit him, first burning pine pitch and smoke thick enough to choke a horse. Sparks danced through the trees, carried by the wind. Samuel's lungs burned as he stumbled up the ridge, shouting for the men to stop. He found them near the clearing, setting fire to a ring of brush. The flames leapt fast, greedy, devouring everything in their path. The sound was deafening, a roar like some living beast. "Stop," Samuel shouted. "You'll kill him." Reeves turned his face slick with sweat, eyes wild. "That's the damn idea." He struck another torch and threw it into the brush. Samuel lunged forward, knocking it from his hand. "You don't understand what you're doing." Reeves shoved him hard. Samuel hit the ground, breath knocked from his chest. He rolled away as another explosion ripped through the trees. One of the dynamite charges had gone off early. The blast threw him backward, dirt and fire raining down. When he opened his eyes, the forest was burning. Trees snapped and fell like matchsticks. Through the smoke he saw a shape moving, massive, dark, lumbering through the fire. The creature. It wasn't running. It was searching. One of the hunters fired. The shot hit a dark patch spreading through the creature's fur. It let out a sound so deep the ground trembled. Samuel's heart broke with the sound. It wasn't rage. It was pain. "Stop!" he cried again, pushing himself up, waving his arms. "He's not the devil, he's mercy." But the men couldn't hear him over the roar of fire. Another shot rang out. Another torch flew. And then the wind shifted. The flames turned, rushing toward them. Reeves cursed, stumbling back as the fire leapt between trees faster than any horse could run. Samuel turned to flee, but the smoke blinded him. He heard one man scream a short, sharp sound, and then the world became nothing but heat and orange light. Through the haze, he saw the creature again staggering toward him. It was wounded fur singed bleeding from its shoulder, but still it moved, eyes fixed on Samuel. He didn't understand until the sound came a crack above. The burning pine groaned, its trunk splitting under the heat. "Look out!" someone shouted. Samuel turned just as the tree came down. There was no time to move. A shadow leapt between him and the falling trunk. The impact shook the ground. Wood splintered. Fire exploded around them. When the smoke cleared, Samuel was on the ground unhurt. The creature was not. It lay beneath the fallen pine, its chest rising and falling in slow, heavy breaths. Its eyes, those strange human eyes, found him. Samuel crawled forward, coughing, the heat searing his skin. "No," he whispered. "No, no, no." He tried to lift the trunk, but it was too heavy. Flames licked closer. The creature reached out a massive hand and pressed it weakly against Samuel's chest as if to stop him. Then with its other hand it fumbled for something at its side, a small glint of gold in the firelight. The wedding ring. It placed the ring in his palm, curling his fingers around it. Tears blurred his vision. Why, he choked. "Why would you save me?" The creature's lips moved. A sound came out low, rough but shaped like words. "Tell her." Samuel leaned closer, tears falling onto the creature's fur. "Tell her what?" The answer came like the last breath of a dying storm. "I'm sorry." The creature's chest rose once more, then went still. For a long moment, Samuel just knelt there holding its hand, his other fist clutching the ring so tight the edges cut his skin. The fire roared around them, painting the sky red. He looked into the creature's face one last time. The eyes were open, but the sorrow was gone. Smoke filled his lungs. He coughed, stumbled, pulled himself free. The fire had surrounded them both. He dragged himself toward a gap between the trees where the smoke thinned, gasping for air. Behind him, the forest burned. He turned back once, watching the flames climb higher, swallowing the fallen giant. And for the first time since Mary disappeared, Samuel fell to his knees and prayed not for himself, but for the thing he'd once called a monster. He whispered through the smoke, "Forgive me, both of you." Then he rose, clutching the ring, and limped toward the light breaking through the burning woods. By dawn, the fire was nothing but ash. The hunters were gone. Some fled, some lost. The land was quiet again, black and broken. Samuel stood at the edge of the clearing, covered in soot, his face streaked with tears. In his palm, the ring gleamed through the grime. He turned it over, reading the faint engraving, "Mary and Sam, 1875. He slipped it onto his finger. The metal was still warm from fire, from death, from something he could never name. He whispered to the empty forest, "You weren't the monster." The wind carried his words through the smoldering trees where smoke twisted like ghosts among the stumps. And somewhere far off in the mist, a single echo rose, not a roar this time, but something softer, almost like forgiveness. Samuel closed his eyes and let it wash over him. For the first time in 10 years, the silence didn't hurt. It felt clean. He turned back toward his cabin, limping through the ashes as the first light of morning broke over the mountains, setting the sky on fire again, this time not with destruction, but with dawn. Part 5. The ring returned. When the last flames died, the forest lay in silence. The snow came again that night, soft, steady, falling over the blackened remains of trees, until even the scars of fire disappeared. By morning there was no sign of the hunters, no tracks, no bodies, only smoke curling faintly from the earth, like the mountain exhaling at last. They never found the creature. Some said the fire had taken it. Others swore it walked out of the blaze back into the deep wilderness where no man dared follow. But Samuel Burke knew better. He had felt its hand. He had heard its words. Things like that don't die. They return to the silence that birthed them. He spent the first few days after the fire rebuilding what little he could. The cabin still stood, though the roof sagged and the air smelled of soot. He moved slow, one leg bound in cloth, every motion a reminder of what had happened. But the ache in his bones was different now, less like pain, more like penance. On the third morning, when the light came pale and thin through the cracked window, Samuel took the ring from his pocket. The gold was darkened, its surface warped from heat, but the engraving was still there. Mary and Sam, 1875. He turned it in his palm, feeling the weight of it heavier now than it had ever been. He set it on the table beside her photograph. The glass was smudged with ash, the colors faded, but her eyes were still kind, still looking straight into him. He took a spade from the corner and stepped outside. The ground was half frozen, but he dug anyway beside the small wooden cross he had placed there years ago. The snow mixed with the dirt, turning to gray slush. When the hole was deep enough, he placed the ring inside next to a folded scrap of red cloth, the remains of Mary's scarf. He whispered something that wasn't quite prayer and wasn't quite farewell. When he finished, he sat there for a long time, his hat in his hands, the wind brushing past his shoulders like a sigh. The forest beyond the clearing was quiet. No birds, no footsteps, no growl. Just the sound of melting snow dripping from the branches. That night he dreamed again. Mary stood by the river the same as before, her hair loose, her scarf trailing behind her. But this time she smiled. She didn't speak. She only reached out her fingers, brushing his cheek warm despite the cold air. Behind her in the shadow of the trees, something moved, a tall figure just out of focus. Its eyes glowed faintly. Not red, not gold, but soft and human. And then the dream faded into dawn. When he woke, the cabin felt lighter somehow. The air no longer pressed down on him. He sat up, rubbed his eyes, and noticed something strange on the table. The ring. He blinked, sure it was a trick of memory, but it was there, clean, polished, and gleaming in the morning light. He reached for it with shaking hands. Inside the band where once the engraving had ended, there were new letters etched deep and careful. Forgiven. He didn't know who had done it or how. Maybe he didn't need to. He slid the ring back onto his finger. It fit perfectly, as though it had been waiting for this moment. For the first time in years, Samuel felt peace, not the hollow, weary kind that comes from giving up, but the quiet certainty that forgiveness had finally found him, even if it came from something he didn't understand. He spent one last day in the cabin, packing what little he owned. A few tools, his coat, the photograph of Mary. When the sun began to sink, he saddled his horse, looked once more at the home that had held a decade of ghosts, and whispered, "Thank you." He rode out across the open field, the snow crunching beneath the horse's hooves. The sky above was wide, and silver clouds drifting slow over the peaks. The smell of pine and smoke still lingered, but beneath it was something new, the faint sweetness of thawing earth of spring. When he reached the edge of the forest, he stopped. The wind stirred the trees, bending them just enough to open a narrow path between the trunks. It felt like the woods were breathing again, alive. Samuel looked into the shadows where the creature had once stood. His hand brushed the ring warm against his skin. He smiled, a small, tired, honest smile. "Maybe love wears fur and walks in the dark," he said softly. "But it's still love." For a moment, everything was still. Then the wind shifted, carrying through the trees a low, distant sound, deep and gentle like thunder, too far to frighten anyone. It wasn't a growl this time. It was something closer to a song. Samuel tipped his hat toward the sound. "Goodbye, friend." He turned the horse toward the rising sun. Behind him, the forest stood silent, the ashes of the fire hidden beneath fresh snow. Ahead lay miles of open prairie gold under the first touch of daylight. As he rode, the light grew stronger, spilling across the land like forgiveness itself. The wind followed him, tugging at his coat, whispering through the grass. Somewhere behind that whisper he thought he heard her voice again. Mary's voice, laughing softly, carried on the breeze. He didn't turn back. He didn't need to. The mountains faded behind him. The cabin disappeared from sight. The ring gleamed faintly on his hand, catching the light of morning. And far behind, deep in the forest that once haunted him, two faint shapes moved through the mist, one tall, one small, walking side by side until they vanished into the trees. The west was quiet again, but not empty. Not anymore. Because some stories don't end in fire. They end in forgiveness. And in the hush between the wind and the earth, if a man listened closely enough, he could still hear that low, kind rumble, Bigfoot's call, rolling through the pines like a promise kept. A sound not of fear but of peace. The sky was gold when the story ended, the kind of gold that belongs only to the West. Quiet, endless, and heavy with memory. The last of the wind moved through the grass, whispering secrets to the earth. Smoke from distant fires rose like thin threads against the light, fading into the morning air. Somewhere far off, a single note from a guitar drifted through the silence, slow, haunting, tender. Samuel Burke had gone his tracks, already fading beneath the snow. The cabin was empty now, its door swaying softly with the wind. But inside on the hearth, where the ashes still glowed faintly, something shimmered, a small circle of gold half buried in the soot. The wedding ring. Its surface caught the light of the rising sun, scattering it across the walls like sparks. For a heartbeat, the entire room seemed alive again, filled with warmth, laughter, and the echoes of all the love it had once held. And outside, beyond the clearing, the forest stirred. Somewhere among the trees came a deep, distant sound, a low, rumbling growl that wasn't a warning, but a farewell, a promise that forgiveness never truly dies. In the wildlands of the West, monsters aren't always evil. Sometimes they carry the souls we thought we'd lost. If this story touched your heart, leave a comment and rate it from 0 to 10. Subscribe and join us again by the fire for another story of the Wild West. The guitar lingers on one final gentle chord. The wind sighs through the dry grass. The fire crackles once, then fades. The screen darkens slowly, leaving only the glow of dawn across the ashes, and the wedding ring gleaming softly in the light of a new morning.